In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house will be the highest of all mountains. Verse 2 of chapter 2 of the book of the prophet Isaiah. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. Verse 39 of chapter 24 of the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel we are starting to read today and will read all through this coming year. I have a good friend, a guy with whom I occasionally play golf, who parlayed a PhD in theater into a highly successful career as a documentary filmmaker for shows like 60 Minutes. But Scott, even though he knew absolutely nothing about meteorology, out of grad school got as his first job a job as a weatherman with a CBS affiliate in Chicago, where minutes before his debut performance, his predecessor, who was ceding to him the weather spot on the evening news, took him aside and said, "Scott, let me give you one piece of advice. Before you go on air to report the weather, take one last look out the window." That pretty much sums up this entire sermon. Before you proceed with anything, check outside. Stick a wet finger in the air. Take one last look out the window, especially in Advent, when we focus on nature as it pushes out Mary's womb toward the natal day of the nativity of her child and ours and that new nation we call the church. Note the Latin root natio for birth behind all those words: nature, natal, nativity, nation. And admit that whether or not you are agnostic about the existence of God, you are an arrogant fool if you are not agnostic about Mother Nature, as unpredictable and uncertain as she is. I mean, where is the snow this morning? Now, Isaiah took one last look out the window and forecast that in days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house, Mount Zion in Jerusalem and Israel, would, through some kind of cataclysmic, seismic upheaval, be raised higher than all the mountains, higher than Mount Sinai, where Moses got the 10 Commandments in the Negev, higher than any other mountain topographically on the face of the planet, high enough actually to touch heaven itself. And having forecast that, he made 3 conclusions. The first is natural and environmental. He observes that it will be raised up so high that it will be higher than the horizon, the limit of the sight of any other nation, which leads to the second conclusion, which is political and global. That seeing it, all the nations will at one moment flow like a river toward it. They will converge upon it at one moment and create enormous chaos and violent conflict, which necessitates the third conclusion, which is pedagogical and juridical, that having come together with such violence, they will need to sit down with one another and do Torah work, pedagogy and juridical work, education and adjudication, in order to work out for themselves, not simply by sticking to the 10 Commandments handed down at Sinai and all those laws, But now that they are at a place where Mount Zion is touching heaven itself, they can get beyond Mount Sinai and hear God's continuing revelation of how, with fresh interpretation, they can work out their life with one another. Matthew, who knew Isaiah in and out and most of the Hebrew Scripture, including all the Targum, the translations, and the Midrash, all the sermons preached on it, he looks at what Isaiah is saying and he says, remember, if you ignore Isaiah, you do it at your peril. You do it at your peril. Because I remember in Noah's day, they were oblivious. They didn't take one last look out the window. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, and they knew nothing. And the flood came and swept them all away. Now, when Matthew himself takes one last look out the window, he sees a different storm, a different enemy than the other evangelists. We have 4 evangelists, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Think of the 4 of them as like the 4 walls of an ancient or medieval city. You know, in an ancient city, the people of the city all congregated in the very middle of the city in times of peace. Here would be the court, the church, the marketplace. In times of peace, that's where everyone is all day. But in times of war, that population moves to whatever window of whatever wall it is that the enemy is coming. Think about this church as an ancient city. There's the center of it. Times of peace, we're all here. But in times of war, if we're facing a different enemy, we move toward a different window. Mark, his enemy is the absurdity of our suffering and the mystery of our death. And so for Mark, he would be at that window. By the cross and the altar of sacrifice, that's what his gospel is about. It's a primordial reading of our existential reality. Very short gospel, only 16 chapters. Luke, he would be at this window. Because for Luke, the result of all of our suffering hasn't eventuated into anything. Life just goes on, one damn thing after another. He writes 52 chapters. It's like looking out that window all the way across the Kay's property to Stephen Bidley's house. And past their music farm, because Luke is the only evangelist who gives us hymns. That's why the organ's on this side. He gives us the Benedictus. He gives us the Nuncimus. He gives us the Magnificat. He gives us the Gloria in His Justice. All the music is in that gospel because the only way to get through it on the long haul is to sing. John is at that door because John's problem is the oppressiveness of the Roman Empire. And as you carry the cross of Christ out into the world, they are going to squash you like that. And whereas Mark says, if you go through suffering and death, you will find resurrection on the other side. John says, in the moment that you lay down your life for your friends, there is your glory in death itself. And Matthew's over here at the pulpit. He's at this window. Matthew's problem is not the Jewish people, but the Jewish leaders who are trying to dissuade the Jewish people from following Jesus. He is a Jew and he takes Scripture seriously, just like the Jewish leaders do. But unlike the Jewish leaders, he takes Jesus even more seriously. And he takes Jesus especially seriously because Jesus is willing to look at the old law and give it a fresh interpretation. He's the only evangelist who has put in Jesus' mouth the prayer, I thank thee, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that thou hast hidden all this stuff from the wise and understanding and revealed it to babes. For such, Father, was thy gracious will. No one knows the Son except the Father. And no one knows the Father except the Son, and him to whom the Son will reveal it. For Matthew, Jesus is the guy who keeps reinterpreting with fresh interpretation as though on top of Mount Zion. And not just back there with the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, the law as it is given to us. And what he's doing, of course, is he is creating a constitution for the church. He's the only evangelist of the four who mentions the word church. He uses the Greek word ekklesia. Ek meaning out of or from, kaleo meaning to call. What is the church? It is a community of people who have been called out of where they were into a new community. Unity in spite of their alterity, all their differences and othernesses. That's the church. And he says that church he's trying to constitute that church. He is, Matthew is the James Madison of antiquity. You know, Madison, who wrote the first draft of our U.S. Constitution, did it only after he had rummaged through Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Law, Hobbes, the War of All Against All, Rousseau, Social Contract, Montesquieu, Locke, the Essays. He read all that stuff in Latin and sat down and wrote the U.S. Constitution. That's what Matthew's doing. Matthew says in chapter 13, he's the only one to say this, that the true scribe of the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who takes out of his treasure things old and things new. Matthew is grabbing onto everything he can to form a new constitution for the church. And he says that constitution has a foundation. It's not an idea, it's not a thing. It is a really kind of working class guy. He's a little confused, he's spiritually spineless, he's socially awkward, he's clumsy, he's often double-minded. His name is St. Peter. He is the rock on which Christ builds his church. And what a wonderful thing that this year, in which St. Peter's Lithgow will think through and discern its profile for the call of its next vicar. That St. Peter's Lithgow, just by the look of the draw, gets this year to read Matthew. And Matthew would have you think about three things as you faithfully this week, as soon as possible, by December 8th, fill in Jim Florek and Leslie Beavis as you think about the constitution of your church. He would have you, first of all, with Isaiah, think naturally and environmentally about what's going on out there. I mean, one of the great things about this church is the land itself. That beautiful sun. This problem. This built environment created by violating wood and stone. Think about the natural and environmental. Secondly, he would have you think globally and politically. Who are the nations that were this raised up on top of Mount Zion would stream like a river to come to St. Peter's? Who's out there in Dutchess County that could be here? Not for the sake of our financial solvency as a parish, God will take care of that, but for the sake of their happiness and the world's health. And finally, think pedagogically and juridically. What should be the constitution of this church? Make a carte blanche in your mind. Work de novo. A tabula rasa. If there were no St. Peter's Church, and we were sitting down back in 1800, the summer of 1800, with Philander Chase, the first rector, and thinking about what kind of church we want to have, to open our new building on May 8, 1801, what would it look like? Ask yourself those questions. Environmental and natural, political and global, pedagogical and juridical. What would the Constitution of us look like? Matthew, of course, would have you think with no presuppositions. Use Scripture, use the heritage, use all we've been given, but also come up with fresh, new ideas. As I was thinking about this sermon, I remembered a sermon preached by the Reverend John Robinson, the founder of the Puritans in England. As those who came to these shores on the Mayflower were leaving, it was his farewell sermon. He did not go with them, but in his sermon he bid them farewell. We do not have the sermon, but we have a first-hand eyewitness account of it. And in the account of it, the author says that Reverend Robinson begged us that if God revealed anything to us tomorrow, we would count it as more worthy than anything he, Robinson, had said to us today, because he said, God, Robinson believed, has yet more light and truth to break forth from his word. We just sang those words because in 1835, George Rawson, a lawyer in Leeds, England, picked up that account of that sermon and wrote, "We limit not the truth of God to our poor reach of mind, to notions of our time and place, crude, partial, and confined. No, let a new and better hope within our hearts be stirred. The Lord has yet more light and truth to break forth." Matthew took one last look out the window. And of course, what he actually saw coming was the Son of Man in judgment, holding us, each of us, to account for how we live and are living our lives. That is, when he looks out the window, he sees God coming as our enemy, furious at our wanton disregard of all he has given us, and our lack of any real fear in his judgment. But also, as Matthew looks out the window suddenly, he feels someone standing beside him, looking out the same window with us, because he sees that the same God who is coming at us as our enemy has in his Son gone, as it were, from God's perspective, behind enemy lines, and is now standing actually in front of us at the window to defend us against God. That's the heart of our Christian theology, is that the one who would otherwise condemn us has actually now come around and stood with us, looking out the window to say to God, "No, God, I'm God too, don't do that." That is, it's not so much looking out the window as feeling the one standing beside us at the window that counts. He is God with us, Emmanuel.